I cannot stress to you how big of a deal today's arguments were at the Supreme Court. The decision this court makes on this issue is going to affect every single person who lives in the United States. Now, this is a deep dive. It is a long video, but you better be paying attention. So if you don't have time to watch it now, favorite it, do whatever you have to do, come back to it when you have a few minutes. And everyone else, pull up a chair, have a seat. It boils down to this. The Supreme Court is now deciding whether it is legal for an individual federal court judge to issue a nationwide injunction that blocks a president from enacting an executive order. This case came to the justices because of President Trump's executive order that would end birthright citizenship. Several federal district and appellate courts have issued nationwide injunctions blocking Trump, saying that order blatantly violates the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. Not to mention 100 years of Supreme Court precedent and laws passed by Congress that all say birthright citizenship applies to all babies born in the United States, regardless of the legal status of that baby's parents. So that's the case. Now, before I share with you what was said in today's oral arguments, I need you to think bigger. Think about this in a bigger context. I don't want you to get hung up on the birthright citizenship issue because, one, that's not actually the question the justices are answering in this case. And two, because if the justices rule in favor of the U.S. government and say, you're correct, government, no single federal court judge should have the right to issue a nationwide injunction that can block a president, that ruling would apply to all presidents, not just Trump. So when the next Democratic president comes into office, he or she could sign an executive order taking away your guns, and no individual federal court judge would be able to issue a nationwide injunction to stop it, even if years later the Supreme Court rules that that Democratic president's executive order was blatantly unconstitutional. Let that sink in. It's crucial for you to understand what goes around comes around. Now, let's talk about what actually happened in court today. The justices heard arguments for more than 2 hours. More than an hour of it was spent grilling President Trump's Solicitor General. The birthright citizenship question was definitely the elephant in the room. They discussed it, but most of the justices, even the conservative ones, seemed very skeptical of allowing the Trump administration to end birthright citizenship with just an executive order. But when it came to the nationwide injunction issue, the conservative justices seemed more open to maybe limiting the use of them. The fact is, we have seen more nationwide injunctions issued by federal court judges in the last 5 presidential administrations than we have in our country's history. It's something the Supreme Court and both Republican and Democratic presidents have been complaining about for years. And the Trump administration told the court they have a solution. They argued to the Supreme Court today, stay with me here, the best solution is to force people who believe their constitutional rights are being violated by a president's executive order to file individual lawsuits or cumbersome class action lawsuits against the administration under what's known as Rule 23. And if that lower court judge agrees and says, absolutely, your rights are being violated, that executive order is unconstitutional, the president cannot enforce it, under the Trump administration's solution, the judge's ruling should only apply to the people or the class of people who are suing, not to the rest of the country. And even then, the Trump administration argued that the federal government would keep using the policy for everyone else in the country who's not part of the lawsuit until years later, if or when the Supreme Court rules.
Look, there are all kinds of abuses of nationwide injunctions. But I think that the question that this case presents is that if one thinks that it's quite clear that the EO is illegal, how does one get to that result, in what time frame, on your set of rules without the possibility of a nationwide injunction?
On this case and on many similar cases, the appropriate way to do it is for there to be multiple lower courts considering it, the appropriate percolation that goes to the lower courts, and then ultimately this court decides the merits in a nationwide binding precedent. You have a complete inversion of that through the nationwide injunctions where the district
So, General
courts
Sauer, are you really going to answer Justice Kagan by saying there's no way to do this expeditiously?
Well, I'll refer to my former answers. Rule 23 provides the tools.
So again, I want you to think, what if the executive order took away your firearms?
You claim that there is absolutely no constitutional way to stop, put this aside, to stop a president from an unconstitutional act, a clearly, indisputably unconstitutional act, taking every gun from every citizen. We couldn't stop that.
I disagree with that for the reasons I've said, including the equitable tools.
No, because you said to us we'd have to wait until there was a final judgment. You're not sure you would respect the judgment of every circuit. You're not sure that you would respect even a final judgment of the Supreme Court because it only binds the parties before it.
What we see, not just in this case, but in the 39 others, is that the district courts who are issuing these injunctions all passionately disagree with the thing that's being challenged in that. So that principle that, well, this we think is really unconstitutional, therefore we should ignore the general principles of Article 3 is not a principle the court ought to adopt. It is a feature, not a bug, of Article 3 that courts grant relief to the people who sue in front of them. So the notion that relief has to be given to the whole world because others who have not taken the time to sue are not before the courts is something that results in all these problems.
The states who are suing the Trump administration told the justices today that the solution Trump's Solicitor General is suggesting is ridiculous. They said putting aside the logistical nightmare of thousands of individual and class action lawsuits bogging down federal courts across the country, the end result of all those things would be for years until the Supreme Court hears the merits of a case, a patchwork of rulings would be in effect. Some people who live in certain states would get some constitutional rights, but other people who live in other states that aren't included in the lawsuits won't. They say that would be chaos. And Justice Jackson alluded to it.
Your argument seems to turn our justice system, in my view at least, into a catch-me-if-you-can kind of regime from the standpoint of the executive, where everybody has to have a lawyer and file a lawsuit in order for the government to stop violating people's rights. Justice Kagan says, let's assume for the purpose of this that you're wrong about the merits, that the government is not allowed to do this under the Constitution, and yet it seems to me that your argument says we get to keep on doing it until everyone who is potentially harmed by it figures out how to file a lawsuit, hire a lawyer, et cetera. And I don't understand how that is remotely consistent with the rule of law.
I think the catch-me-if-you-can problem operates in the opposite direction, where we have the government racing from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, having to sort of clear the table in order to implement a new policy. Percolation of novel, sensitive constitutional issues is a merit of our system. It is not a bad feature of the system.
So what's going to happen? The Supreme Court could do a number of things. They could just blanketly stop all lower courts from issuing all nationwide injunctions. They could do nothing and say, leave the system the way it is. Or they could come up with some kind of new limitation on when a lower court judge is allowed to issue a nationwide injunction. The court could also rule on the birthright citizenship issue. There's really no telling if they're going to take that up or not. This ruling, though, we know will be issued in late June.